If someone had told me that following Christ would mean losing everything, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But in that cold, dark cell, I learned that he was everything I needed. My name is Simon, and what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story of pain and suffering. It's about transformation, unwavering faith, and miracles that defy human logic. When I was arrested, it felt like everything was over. I had a simple life, but it was filled with purpose. My faith in Jesus was my greatest treasure, but in a split second, I was stripped of everything. My freedom, my family, even my dignity, all gone just because I chose to follow Christ. And it was in that dungeon where light was a luxury I couldn't afford that I began to understand that maybe this was exactly the price I had to pay for loving him. In the first few days, the screams echoed through the walls. They weren't mine, but they could have been. The sound of chains and the suffering of others made me question if I was really ready to pay the cost of being a Christian. The physical pain was unbearable, but the mental torture was even worse. I felt the weight of loneliness and doubt. Was it really worth it? I wondered, trying to make sense of what I had done wrong. But even in the pain, something deep inside me told me that there was a reason for all this. The guards weren't just cruel. They were merciless. They tortured me in ways that no one should ever have to endure. And yet, through it all, something in me wouldn't break. Every strike, every humiliation seemed to strengthen my faith. When Jesus' words about suffering for him began to resonate in my heart, I realized that something deeper was happening. I wasn't alone anymore. God was right there with me, even in that prison. No one knew where I was. My hands were tied, but my soul was being set free. I found myself caught between fear and trust. How could I trust in a God who seemed to have abandoned me? But it was right there, in the darkest place, that I learned the true meaning of Christ's love. Every time I fell, he lifted me. Every time the pain made me want to quit, he held me up. Then something unbelievable happened. The very place that seemed like the end of my story became the beginning of something far greater. Something that to this day, I can't fully explain. The first night without physical pain was a miracle. I was completely exhausted, but something supernatural surrounded me. It wasn't just relief, it was a peace so deep, it felt like God himself was right there with me. I knew that the transformation happening in me was not from this world. It was divine. But before we go on, I want you to take a moment and reflect on your own faith. If you're going through a tough time right now, know that even in the darkest moments, Christ's light can shine through. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and leave a comment. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do that now so you don't miss the next chapters of this life-changing story. It was just another Sunday. I didn't feel like going to church, honestly. The last thing I wanted was to sit in a pew listening to the same old songs and sermons. But there was something different about that morning. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me just couldn't ignore the pull to go. Maybe it was the weight of my own struggles. Or maybe I was just tired of living for myself. Either way, I went. As I walked into that church, the usual feelings of emptiness and routine tried to settle in. But then something happened. The pastor started speaking, and for the first time in a long time, his words cut right through all the noise in my head. He was preaching on John 14 verse 6, where Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." I had heard it a million times before, but that day, those words hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized I had been walking in so many different directions, searching for truth, but all along, the answer was standing right in front of me. I remember sitting there, feeling the weight of that verse. It wasn't just words on a page anymore, it was life. The life I had been missing. I had spent so many years chasing after things that couldn't satisfy me. Relationships, jobs, approval, even my own pride. But none of it filled the hole in my heart. That morning, I could feel something shifting in me. Maybe for the first time, I actually believed that Jesus could give me something more. It wasn't like a loud, dramatic voice from heaven or a burning bush. No, it was quieter than that. It was more like a whisper, a quiet, gentle pull. But that pull, That invitation to truly follow Jesus, it was undeniable. I had always believed in God, but I hadn't truly followed him. I hadn't surrendered my life. That day, in that quiet church, I made a decision. I said yes to Jesus. The truth is, I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't know where this path would take me or how hard things would get. But I knew in that moment that I couldn't go back to the life I had been living. The weight of my sin, the burden of my mistakes, all of it felt so heavy. And for the first time, I felt something else, a peace that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a knowing that I was forgiven, that God wasn't holding my past against me. I'll never forget the moment the pastor closed the service. He asked, "If you've made the decision to follow Christ today, I want you to stand up." In that instant, my legs didn't even feel like they were my own. I stood up. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't feel some huge rush of emotion in that very moment, but I knew that something had just shifted. That simple act of standing was my way of telling God, "I'm ready. I'm ready to follow you no matter what." The next few days were a blur. It wasn't easy, and I didn't suddenly have all the answers. In fact, I had more questions than ever. But one thing was for sure, I was no longer walking alone. Jesus was with me. And though the road ahead would be anything but smooth, I had a peace that only he could give. That moment in church was just the beginning, but I had no idea how much my life was about to change. I didn't know then, but that decision to say yes to Christ would lead me down paths I never could have imagined. Paths that would challenge my faith, test my strength, and ultimately bring me closer to the heart of God than I ever thought possible. At first, it was just little things. The jokes from my friends, those playful jabs when they found out I'd given my life to Jesus. "Oh, Simon, you're one of those now," they'd say, chuckling. It didn't bother me much at first. I thought it was just part of the process, part of people not really understanding what I was doing. But deep down, I could feel the sting. It was like they saw me as different now, as someone they couldn't relate to anymore. Then, my family started to get a little worried. They didn't understand why I was suddenly so religious. I remember my mom saying, "You're going to church again? This isn't you." And my dad, always the skeptic, would ask, "Do you really think this is the answer, Simon? You can't just throw your life away on some faith thing." They weren't angry, but they were concerned. And the doubt in their eyes hurt. It was as if the person they had known all their life wasn't the same anymore. At work, it got even trickier. The office jokes, the after-work hangouts, and even the promotions I was passed over for, it was like a subtle, growing tension. People started to see my faith as a weakness. When conversations turned to gossip or unethical choices, I found myself standing out in ways that felt uncomfortable. There were times I wanted to just blend in, to laugh along with the jokes, or ignore the shady deals that were happening around me. But I couldn't. Something inside me said, "You can't go back now." So, I stood firm. But then came the first real threat. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't just a disapproving comment or a quiet side-eye. No, this time it was real. I had been called into my boss's office after work one evening. He didn't even look at me when he spoke, just stared down at the papers in front of him. "Simon," he said coldly, "I've been hearing things. People are saying that you're trying to force your beliefs on others. If that's true, you need to stop. We don't tolerate that here." I could feel my heart pounding. I tried to explain, to tell him I wasn't trying to push anything on anyone. But he wasn't having it. "You're a good worker, Simon," he said, "but this Christian thing? It's going to get you in trouble." And with that, he dismissed me. I left that office with a heavy weight in my chest. The stakes had just gotten real. This wasn't just about a few uncomfortable conversations anymore. My faith was starting to cost me. The weight of that moment didn't fully hit me until the next day, when I realized that my boss had spoken to other people in the office. My coworkers started giving me the cold shoulder, and some outright avoided me. It was like I had become a pariah, all because I had decided to follow Jesus. And in that moment, I understood what it really meant to be persecuted for your faith. It wasn't about being locked up or tortured. It was about losing the respect and acceptance of the world you once knew. But even in that moment of rejection, something inside me began to rise. It wasn't anger or bitterness. No, it was a quiet strength. I realized that no matter what happened, my identity was in Christ. He had called me, and He had never promised that the road would be easy. But He did promise that I would never walk it alone. That's when I realized that the price of faith wasn't just about giving up things I enjoyed. It was about standing firm in a world that didn't always understand. It was about holding on to my convictions, even when the world around me wanted to tear them down. I wasn't going to deny what I had found in Jesus, no matter the cost. That's when I knew that the journey had just begun. And though the road ahead would be tough, I was ready. The sound of those keys locking the cell still echoes in my mind. It was a cold, metallic sound, a sound that symbolized the beginning of everything I feared. I was alone, or at least that's what I thought. At first, I couldn't even comprehend what was happening. One moment, I was in my office, trying to navigate the mess of my faith in a hostile world. The next, I was thrown into a dark, damp cell with nothing but my own thoughts. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and the air was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had led me to this point. The fear that gripped me in those first few moments was like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear of being utterly and completely alone. I couldn't see the light of day. I couldn't hear the sounds of life. There was only silence and the occasional footsteps of a guard pacing by. I sat on the cold stone floor, my back pressed against a rough wall, and for the first time in years, I felt truly helpless. What had I done to deserve this? I remember asking myself over and over, "Why, God? Why would you let this happen? I had been faithful. I had followed you. I had made sacrifices for your name. And now I was in a cell, abandoned by the very world I tried to save." My heart was full of doubts, and my mind spun in circles. Was I really doing the right thing? Was this my reward for following Jesus? The questions came so fast and so hard, I could hardly catch my breath. Every hour felt like a lifetime. The isolation weighed on me, crushing me slowly. The other prisoners around me shouted, cursed, and wept, but I felt like an island in the middle of the ocean, completely separated from them, from everything. There were moments when I felt my faith begin to slip away, when I wanted to give in to the darkness and stop fighting. What if all this talk about God's presence and peace was just a lie? What if He wasn't actually here? What if this was just the price I had to pay, and I was meant to suffer in silence? But then, in the quietest of moments, I heard a voice, not audibly, but deep within my spirit. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but it was undeniable. It was as if God Himself was speaking to me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. "I am with you, Simon, even here." Those words didn't change my circumstances, but they changed something deep within me. Suddenly, it wasn't just me in that cell. Jesus was with me. And even though I couldn't see Him, I could feel His presence, steadying me, giving me strength. The doubt didn't disappear, but the fear began to fade. The more I leaned into God's presence, the more I realized that this wasn't just punishment. It was preparation. God was molding me in a way I couldn't yet understand. He was teaching me to rely on Him in ways that I never had to before. I had no choice but to let go of everything, even my doubts, and trust that God had a plan for me, even in the darkest places. I couldn't know at the time how much worse things would get, how much more I would have to endure. But I learned something that night that would stick with me forever. God doesn't leave us in the darkest moments. He doesn't walk away when we're facing our hardest battles. In fact, it's often in those moments that we experience Him in ways we never could have imagined. So, let me ask you this. What would you do if your faith was all you had left? Would you still hold on? Would you still trust that God is with you even in your darkest hour? Because in the end, that's what truly matters. That's what we have to remember when we're facing trials we don't understand. Our faith is never in vain. The pain was unbearable. I remember each strike, each blow that came from those guards. They wanted me to renounce Jesus. They wanted to break me. The darkness around me became more suffocating with every hit, every demand for me to deny my faith. Each blow felt like an invitation to give up, to surrender, to stop fighting. The pain was intense, and for a moment, I wondered if I could take any more. What if I just said it? What if I just gave in? But then something in me resisted. Even in that pain, there was a quiet strength that wouldn't let me go. It wasn't me holding on, it was God. His presence was stronger than the beating, more real than the fear that flooded my heart. At the lowest point, when I could hardly breathe, I heard his whisper in the midst of it all, "I am with you." It was almost as if his words were a shield, holding me together when everything else felt like it was falling apart. I can't describe exactly how it happened, but I knew in that moment that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just a prisoner in that cold, dark room. I wasn't just Simon, broken and bleeding. I was a son of the Most High God, and no amount of physical pain or emotional torment could change that. In the midst of all that suffering, I was reminded that Jesus himself had been tortured, that he had endured far worse than I ever would. If he could go through that for me, then I could endure anything with him by my side. But it wasn't just physical pain. It was the mental and emotional toll that almost broke me. The doubt that crept in, is this really worth it? What's the point of all this? There were moments, especially when the blows felt endless, that I just wanted to quit. I would pray, but it felt like my words were just echoes in the silence. My heart cried out for relief, but it felt like God was silent, like he wasn't hearing me. Was he really there? And then, in the midst of my despair, something supernatural happened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a vision of angels or a light shining through the darkness. It was something much more personal. It was a feeling, a deep, undeniable peace that flooded my soul. In that moment, I wasn't just surviving. I was being held. I wasn't just a man in pain. I was a man in the arms of a loving Savior who would never leave me. I closed my eyes, and it was like I could almost hear Jesus himself saying, "You're not alone. I'm right here with you." His voice wasn't a loud shout or a booming command. It was a quiet reassurance, like the softest whisper of comfort you could imagine. And suddenly, the pain didn't seem quite as overwhelming. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it bearable. I wasn't broken beyond repair. I wasn't a lost cause. In that moment, I realized something incredible. I was still alive, still holding on, still able to trust in a God who was bigger than all of it. The days that followed were hard, yes. The torture didn't stop, but I could feel something in me changing. I wasn't the same man who had walked into that prison months ago. Something had been broken, but not destroyed. The world could beat me down. They could try to silence my faith, but they could never take away the hope that burned in my heart. That hope was stronger than anything they could do to me. Through it all, I clung to one truth. Jesus was with me, even when it felt like everything else was falling apart. And that truth kept me going. It kept me from breaking completely. Every night, I would whisper a prayer through the pain. "Lord, you are with me. You will not leave me." And each time, he reminded me of his presence, his power, and his love. When the doors finally creaked open, I could hardly believe my eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was staring at a sliver of light. It wasn't just the light from the outside world. It was as if the darkness that had been suffocating me for so long was beginning to retreat. The chains that had held me physically, emotionally, spiritually were breaking. I couldn't move at first. I just stood there stunned. Is this real? I thought. It felt like a dream. After everything, after all the pain, the suffering, the doubt, I was finally free. I was escorted out of that cell by guards who seemed just as confused as I was. They didn't say much, probably because they didn't understand what was happening either. But I didn't care about their confusion. I was more focused on the fact that I was walking out of that place. Step by step, I felt the weight of my old life lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just my body being freed. It was my soul, my heart. God had answered my cries. He had heard me in the darkness, and He had made a way when there seemed to be no way. The details of how it all happened are still a mystery to me. I don't know if it was a change in the political climate or if someone in power had a change of heart. I don't know if it was the prayers of the church back home, or if it was just God working His will in a way I couldn't understand. All I know is that the moment those doors opened, I knew that it was God who had made it happen. It was His timing, His will, and His grace that had brought me out of that hellhole. There's no other explanation. As I walked out of that prison, the world outside looked different. The sun, which I had forgotten existed, felt like a gift. Every breath I took was a reminder of God's mercy. But as I looked around, I realized something powerful. I had been free long before those doors opened. I had been set free in my heart the moment I chose to follow Jesus. The prison walls could hold my body, but they couldn't hold my spirit. And no amount of physical torment could ever take away the peace that God had given me deep within. It's crazy, because even though I was physically in chains, I had been set free in my soul. I had experienced true liberation in the middle of my pain. The freedom I had in Christ wasn't something that could be taken away by men or circumstances. And as I stood outside those walls, I realized that my time in prison had been the very thing that brought me closer to Jesus. It wasn't the circumstances I would have chosen, but God used it to shape me, to mold me, and to show me that my identity was never in my situation. It was in Christ. I thought about everything I had endured, the beatings, the threats, the isolation. I thought about the moments when I almost gave up, when I wondered if it was all in vain. And I realized now that every second of suffering had brought me closer to the heart of God. I had been stripped of everything, the comforts, the safety, the security, and yet, in that stripping, I had found everything. I had found the most important thing in life, the presence of Jesus. And I couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the trials that had tested my faith. Grateful for the pain that had drawn me nearer to the one who could heal all wounds. I was walking out of that prison not just with my body, but with a renewed heart and a deeper relationship with Jesus than I had ever imagined. I had been set free, not just physically but spiritually. As I left that place, I had a sense that my mission wasn't over. In many ways, it had just begun. God had brought me through the fire, and now He was calling me to share my story, to let others know that no matter how dark it gets, God is able to set you free. He can break your chains, no matter how long they've held you. And if He did it for me, He can do it for you too. As I sit here now looking back on everything I've been through, I can honestly say that it was all worth it. The pain, the betrayal, the darkness, everything. I've learned things about God, about faith, and about life that I never would have understood if I hadn't gone through those trials. What I came to realize is that following Christ isn't about comfort. It's not about having it easy. It's about trust. It's about putting your life in His hands, even when everything around you is falling apart. Because when you trust Him, He will never let you go. I remember asking myself over and over again, why is this happening to me? I would look at my beaten body, at the scars on my skin, and wonder where God was in all of it. But what I failed to see at the time was that He was right there with me. Every step of the way, He was there. In the silence of that prison, in the cold, in the dark moments of doubt, He was with me. Not to take me out of the suffering, but to walk me through it. And that was where I learned that God's presence doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means His companionship in the midst of it. The more I reflect on those moments, the more I see that it wasn't the circumstances that defined me. It was how I responded to them. It was my faith that carried me. Faith that God would never abandon me. Faith that He had a purpose, even when I couldn't see it. You see, I was being shaped. I was being molded into something I didn't even recognize at the time. But I know now it was for something greater. I know now that God doesn't waste pain. He uses it. He uses our suffering to refine us, to teach us, and to show us the depths of His love in ways we could never experience on the mountaintops. If you would have told me years ago that I would be standing here today sharing this story with you, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought you were crazy. But now I know this is my testimony. This is my story of redemption. God took the broken pieces of my life, the shattered parts that seemed beyond repair, and He made something beautiful out of it. Something that has purpose. And I want you to know that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how broken you feel, God can do the same for you. He's in the business of taking the mess and making it into a masterpiece. So let me ask you, if you were tested like I was, what would you do? Would you stand firm, or would you fall? Would you continue to trust in God, even when everything seems to be falling apart? I want you to think about your faith, your relationship with God, and ask yourself, do I trust Him that much? Because I can tell you from experience that when everything else fails, when the world turns its back on you, the only thing that remains is the love of Jesus. And that love, it's enough to carry you through. My prayer for you is that you will find the strength I found, that you will discover that no matter what you go through, God is faithful, that His presence is enough. I pray that you won't just survive your trials, but that you will thrive through them. I pray that your faith will grow deeper, and that you will see your life as a testimony of His power to heal, to restore, and to make all things new. God can turn your pain into purpose. And now, as I stand before you, I can say it without hesitation, it was worth it. Every moment, every hardship, every tear, because Jesus is worth it. He is the treasure in the field, the pearl of great price. He is everything. And when you find Him, you realize nothing else matters. I wouldn't change a thing about my journey, because through it all I found Him, and He is enough. So I encourage you, hold on to Jesus. No matter what you're going through, no matter how dark it gets, never let go of Him. He is faithful. And I promise you, in the end, you'll say the same thing I do. It was all worth it. Because He is worth it. As I sit here, in this peaceful place, reflecting on everything I've been through, I can't help but be filled with gratitude. God has been so faithful to me, and I pray that this story has sparked something in your heart today. If you found any hope or encouragement in what I've shared, I want to ask you to do something. Take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And hey, if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's struggling or feels alone. Let them know that God is with them, just like He's been with me. Also, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear how God has been sustaining you through your journey. Let's continue this conversation and build each other up in faith. I'm looking forward to hearing your story. God bless you.